Before the fire reached human hands, it belonged only to the gods. It was guarded, measured, and withheld with intent. Without it, humanity remained weak, dependent, and easily erased. He saw that clearly. He also saw what the gods planned next. The decision came before the theft, long before the punishment. When he moved, it was not an act of rebellion, but of certainty. Some lines, once understood, cannot remain unbroken. He watched them debate the future of humans as if it were a calculation, reduce their numbers, delay their progress, let them fail quietly. Fire would end that plan. Fire would give them tools, memory, and time. He understood the cost immediately. There would be no forgiveness for this choice, no reversal. What mattered was not survival for him, but interruption. If the order continued unchanged, humanity would never be allowed to rise on its own. The act itself required patience, not strength. Fire was never meant to be stolen in haste. It was stored, rationed, and monitored. He waited for routine to dull vigilance, for certainty to replace caution. When the moment came, there was no hesitation. He did not look back toward Olympus. He moved forward, knowing that once fire crossed that threshold, there would be no argument capable of undoing what followed. Fire changed more than warmth. It changed pace. Humans no longer waited for permission from seasons or gods. They shaped metal, cooked food, and gathered at night to plan instead of endure. This acceleration was noticed immediately. Progress left a visible trail. Smoke rose where silence once existed. For the first time, divine order detected a variable it had not authorized, and the source of that variable was already known. The response was not immediate punishment, it was observation. The gods watched cities change shape, nights grow longer, and minds sharpen. What unsettled them was not the flame itself, but how quickly humans adapted to it. Dependence began to fade, questions followed, authority felt less absolute. By the time they agreed on a response, the damage was already irreversible. Fire had done what no army ever had. It made removal costly. They did not accuse him publicly at first. They searched for containment, limits, adjustments that could reverse the effect without exposing the breach. None worked. Fire spread faster than decree. Every attempt to restrict it only taught humans how to preserve it longer. That was when the focus shifted from the act to the one who made it possible. The crime was no longer the fire itself, it was the example. When they finally summoned him, it was not to ask why. It was to confirm what they already knew. He did not deny the theft. He described it precisely, where the fire was taken, how it was carried, how it was delivered. The calm of his confession unsettled them more than defiance would have. There was no plea for mercy, only the certainty that what had been done could not be undone. The verdict was decided before the words were spoken. This was not a mistake to be corrected. It was a precedent to be erased. Mercy would invite imitation. Silence would imply consent. The punishment needed to be absolute and visible, not for him, but for anyone who might consider repeating the act. What mattered was not balance, but deterrence. The fire could remain. He could not remain unmarked for it. They chose a punishment that would never end. Chains forged by divine hands, a mountain where escape was impossible. Each day, pain would return without memory of relief. Each night, recovery would reset the sentence. The message was simple. Knowledge given too freely would be paid for endlessly. He listened without resistance. The terms were clear. What surprised them was not his silence, but his acceptance. The sentence was carried out without ceremony. No audience, no appeal. He was bound where time itself felt suspended. There was no trial to remember, only routine suffering meant to outlast memory. What the gods underestimated was endurance. Pain was constant, but awareness never faded. Each cycle reinforced the same truth. The fire could be taken back from humans. What had changed in them could not. The punishment was meant to end the story. Instead, it extended it. Each day he remained bound. Humans continued to learn what fire allowed. Tools became permanent, shelters stronger, memory longer. The gods watched progress accelerate, while the source of their warning endured in silence. What unsettled them was not his suffering, but its failure to undo the act. The fire did not fade, and neither did the consequences of allowing it to exist. As seasons passed, his suffering became background noise to the gods. Routine dulls even punishment. What did not dull was the result of the theft. Humans began to build faster than destruction could erase them. Knowledge moved ahead of fear. The chain was meant to warn others. Instead, it marked the moment when authority failed to reverse time. The gods realized too late that the sentence had frozen him, not the future he had unlocked. From his position, he could not see the cities, but he understood what was happening there. Fire teaches continuity. It allows mistakes to survive long enough to become improvements. Every spark carried a lesson the gods could no longer retract. What they had intended as containment had become separation. He remained bound to the mountain, while humanity moved forward without looking back. The distance between them was no longer physical. It was irreversible. That distance forced a new silence. The gods stopped speaking of him, as if naming the act would strengthen it. What could not be undone was ignored instead. But ignorance does not erase cause. Every human advance traced back to that single breach. The mountain held his body, not his influence. While he endured, the world he altered continued expanding beyond divine correction. The punishment had limits. The effect did not. What followed was not regret but calculation. The gods measured progress against pain, hoping one would cancel the other. It never did. Humans adapted faster than suffering could warn them. Fire became culture, culture became memory, memory became ambition. Each advance confirmed what they refused to say aloud. The punishment had failed as a correction. It remained only as an example of how late authority reacts when control is already lost. The silence surrounding him became intentional. Stories of his act were discouraged, reshaped, or reduced to warnings stripped of context. The theft was framed as madness, not choice. But humans remembered results, not decrees. Fire had already changed how they thought, not just how they survived. What began as a single transgression was now embedded in every tool, every shelter, every plan made after dark. The gods had punished the man, but the idea had escaped them. Time altered the meaning of his sentence. What was meant as eternal warning became distant myth. Humans no longer feared the punishment because they no longer saw it. They saw only what fire allowed them to build and protect. Distance softened consequence. Progress obscured origin. The gods realized that pain unseen does not instruct. It only records failure. And the record was growing, written in cities, tools, and ambitions that no chain could reach. That realization arrived slowly. Authority had relied on fear, but fear requires proximity. With distance, fear decays. What remained was gratitude, unspoken but persistent. Humans did not know his name, yet they lived inside his decision. Every controlled flame repeated the act without permission. The gods faced an outcome they had not planned for. Punishment had created a future that no command could recall, and no silence could contain. By then, the punishment had outlived its purpose. It no longer warned, it no longer corrected, it simply existed. Meanwhile, humanity crossed thresholds the gods had once guarded alone. Craft turned into knowledge, knowledge into power. The imbalance was no longer theoretical, it was visible. What began as an act meant to help the weak had rewritten the structure of the world itself, and the one who caused it remained conscious, bound, and fully aware of what his choice had unleashed. The imbalance forced a reckoning the gods had delayed for too long. Humans were no longer fragile participants in the world. They altered it. They resisted it. They planned beyond survival. Fire had become independence. At that point, no punishment could reverse the shift without destroying what had already grown. The gods understood the final cost of restraint. To erase his act now would mean erasing humanity with it, and that price was one they were unwilling to pay. That unwillingness changed everything. Authority that cannot act loses shape. The gods began adjusting instead of commanding, reacting instead of ruling. Humanity noticed, boundaries blurred. Fire was no longer a gift or a theft, it was assumed. What had once required permission now required justification to remove. The balance of power shifted quietly, without revolt or war. And the cause of that shift remained chained, enduring the proof of his decision in real time. With control reduced to reaction, the gods began rewriting their own rules. What had been absolute became conditional. Exceptions multiplied. Fire forced flexibility, and flexibility weakened certainty. Humanity learned faster than authority could adapt. Every adjustment confirmed the same truth. The order had not been challenged by force, but by foresight. Bound to the mountain, he became the measure of a shift that no decree could reverse. The punishment endured, but its meaning inverted. What once warned against disobedience now testified to resolve. His silence became a constant reminder that some decisions are made, knowing the cost will never end. The gods avoided the mountain. Humans moved closer to the future. Between them stood a fact no one could erase. Fire had not been stolen in desperation. It had been given with intent, and intent, once acted upon, does not fade. That intent forced a quiet division. The gods continued to rule, but no longer with certainty. Humanity continued to grow, but without understanding the full price that had been paid. Between command and consequence stood a choice that could not be reversed. The fire was no longer the issue. The issue was that someone had proven the order could be broken knowingly and survived long enough to make it matter. That realization unsettled more than the theft ever had. If one act could fracture certainty without immediate collapse, then authority was not as permanent as believed. The gods continued enforcing order, but now with awareness of its limits. Humanity sensed the change instinctively. Confidence grew where fear once restrained it. Bound and suffering, he remained the fixed point in that shift. Proof that obedience was not the only path history could take. Over time, the gods understood they were no longer correcting an error. They were managing its aftermath. Fire had moved beyond utility and become expectation. Humans assumed continuity, improvement, and survival as rights rather than privileges. That shift could not be punished without exposing weakness. What remained was compromise disguised as control. And every compromise traced back to a single decision made long before chains were ever forged. That decision continued shaping outcomes long after memory of the act faded. Humans no longer asked who allowed the fire. They asked what else could be taken, learned, or built. Curiosity replaced caution. Ambition replaced obedience. The gods observed a pattern they could not reverse. Progress no longer waited for approval. It advanced by assumption. Bound to the mountain, he witnessed the slow confirmation that the future now moved without permission. What troubled the gods most was not defiance, but replication. Fire taught humans how to preserve knowledge, pass it forward, and improve upon it. One generation no longer reset the next. Mistakes became lessons. Lessons became methods. The act they had tried to isolate had multiplied itself. The punishment remained singular. The result was exponential. For the first time, authority faced growth it could neither slow nor fully understand. Attempts to reclaim control became symbolic. Declarations without enforcement. Warnings without reach. Humanity learned to navigate around them, not confront them. Fire had taught adaptation, and adaptation made resistance unnecessary. The gods recognized the final irony. The punishment was meant to preserve order, yet it had produced a world that no longer required their constant supervision. Bound and enduring, he remained the proof that foresight can outlast authority. By then, the gods faced a dilemma with no clean answer. To reclaim the fire would mean admitting fear of what humans had become. To leave it meant accepting a future shaped without permission. They chose endurance over admission. The punishment remained. The world moved on. What had started as a theft had become a permanent shift, and the one who caused it stayed conscious, measuring time by the distance between intention and consequence. The suffering did not break him, but it clarified everything. Pain became rhythm. Time became witness. From the mountain, he understood what the gods refused to name. Fire had not empowered humans by accident. It had forced responsibility onto them. Survival was no longer granted. It was earned daily. The order that once decided outcomes now watched them unfold. Bound in place, he became the silent measure of a world that no longer waited for permission. From that vantage, he saw something the gods avoided. Humans did not become grateful, they became capable. Fire removed excuses, not obedience. With each generation, reliance on divine correction diminished. What emerged was not rebellion, but independence. The gods had feared chaos, yet what followed was structure built from choice rather than command. The punishment remained constant. The world it tried to prevent no longer needed divine approval to exist. That independence carried an unseen cost. Without divine correction, humans faced the weight of their own failures. Fire gave them power, but not wisdom. Progress accelerated alongside error. Wars became more destructive. Creations outpaced restraint. The gods watched a world growing beyond guidance, shaped by a gift that could not be recalled. Bound and enduring, he remained aware that foresight does not guarantee control, only consequence. That consequence widened the divide. Humans learned faster than they learned to limit themselves. Fire fueled ambition as much as survival. What began as progress started producing excess, rivalry, and reach without restraint. The gods understood the irony too late. By denying wisdom and granting punishment alone, they had ensured imbalance. Bound to the mountain, he watched creation race ahead of judgment, knowing the gift had solved one problem and opened many more. That realization changed how the gods spoke among themselves. The theft was no longer discussed as crime, but as catalyst. Fire had accelerated humanity past thresholds the order was not prepared to manage. Intervention now risked exposure. Withdrawal risked irrelevance. Between those choices they hesitated, and hesitation allowed time to do what authority could not. It normalized the future. Bound and enduring, he understood that delay was no longer neutral. It had become permission. Permission reshaped belief faster than law ever could. Humans stopped seeing the gods as arbiters of possibility and began treating them as distant forces, powerful but optional. Fire had redrawn the hierarchy without confrontation. The gods still existed. They were simply no longer necessary in every decision. Bound to the mountain, he felt the shift before it was spoken. The world was not rebelling. It was quietly reorganizing itself around what worked. That reorganization carried a danger the gods had never faced before. Influence fades faster than power. Shrines remained, rituals continued, but necessity vanished. Fire allowed humans to solve problems without appeal. Each solution reinforced the same lesson. Authority that is not required becomes symbolic. Symbolic power survives on belief alone. Bound and watching, he understood that belief erodes quietly, not through defiance, but through usefulness being replaced. What followed was not collapse but dilution. The gods remained present yet less central. Their voices carried weight but no urgency. Humanity no longer waited for signs. It tested, failed, adjusted, and continued. Fire had taught iteration. Iteration replaced obedience. The punishment endured unchanged, but its relevance diminished with every generation that learned to stand without instruction. Bound and enduring, he witnessed authority thinning, not breaking, fading into background noise. At that point, the act no longer belonged to him alone. It had outgrown its origin. Fire existed independently of intent, memory, or myth. Humanity treated it as a given, not a gift. The gods could punish the man forever and still never reach the outcome he had created. Bound and conscious, he understood the final shape of his decision. Some actions do not seek forgiveness, they seek permanence. With permanence came reinterpretation. Stories began reshaping the act into warning, lesson, or myth, depending on who spoke. Details shifted, motives blurred, but the result remained fixed. Fire was everywhere. Civilization carried it forward without asking why it had once been forbidden. The gods watched their authority dissolve into narrative. Bound to the mountain, he became less a criminal and more a reference point, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. That transformation unsettled the gods more than rebellion ever could. Myths are harder to control than laws. Once the story escaped them, it stopped serving order. Some told it as sacrifice, others as defiance. None told it as mistake. Humanity did not ask whether the act was right. It asked whether it had worked. Bound and enduring, he realized the final irony. The gods had punished the act, but humanity had judged the outcome. Judgment settled quietly, not in temples but in practice. Fire stayed, progress stayed, memory adjusted around results. The gods retained power, yet lost authorship over the future. Humanity did not reject them. It simply stopped waiting. Bound and conscious, he understood what the punishment had confirmed. Authority can survive loss of control. What it cannot survive is becoming irrelevant to what comes next. Over time, the punishment itself became symbolic. Few remembered where it began, but everyone lived with what it enabled. Fire no longer pointed back to a crime. It pointed forward to possibility. The gods maintained order where they could, but the center had shifted. Bound and enduring, he understood that the future rarely honors origins. It honors outcomes, and outcomes had already chosen their side. What remained was not victory or defeat, but permanence. The act had settled into the structure of the world. Fire no longer symbolized rebellion. It symbolized continuity. Humanity planned around it, built with it, taught it forward. The gods adapted to a reality they had not authored. Bound and conscious, he became less a warning and more a constant. Proof that a single choice, once released, can outlive every attempt to contain it. As generations passed, the man behind the act began to recede. His suffering persisted, but knowledge of it thinned. What remained was a shadow of intention, reshaped by storytellers and fear. Some called him reckless, others called him necessary. Few agreed on motive, yet all lived within the result. Bound and enduring, he understood the final cost. When an act reshapes the world eventually forgets who paid for it. That forgetting completed the transformation. The act no longer belonged to a man, but to history. Fire was inherited without question, its origin buried beneath progress. Humanity did not feel indebted. It felt entitled. The gods watched a world functioning without reverence, sustained by a gift taken too long ago to be contested. Bound and conscious, he became the last witness to the moment when sacrifice stopped being remembered and started being assumed. That assumption reshaped morality itself. What was once unthinkable became precedent. If fire could be taken and retained, then other limits invited challenge. Humanity learned to test boundaries quietly, without asking permission or forgiveness. The gods sensed the shift, but lacked a response that did not expose weakness. Bound and enduring, he understood the pattern he had started. Progress does not announce rebellion. It normalizes it. That normalization carried a final consequence the gods could no longer deny. Authority that adapts too slowly becomes background noise. Humanity no longer reacted to divine warning with fear, only calculation. What mattered was not approval, but outcome. Fire had taught them that survival favors results over reverence. Bound and conscious, he understood the quiet truth. The greatest disruption was not the theft itself, but what it taught others they could get away with. By then, even the gods stopped speaking of restoration. There was nothing left to restore. The world had reorganized itself around what worked, not around who ruled. Fire was no longer a symbol. It was infrastructure. Humanity built futures that assumed continuity, not permission. Bound and enduring, he recognized the final shape of his act. It had not liberated humans from the gods. It had made the gods optional. That realization settled into silence. The gods remained powerful, but no longer central. Humanity no longer measured its future against divine will, only against possibility. Fire burned without memory, without gratitude, without fear. Bound and conscious, he understood what his punishment could never erase. Some gifts do not create loyalty, they create independence. And independence, once learned, does not ask who first made it possible. Independence reshaped belief without ceremony. Humans still spoke of gods, but no longer waited for them. Fire had taught anticipation, planning, and self-trust. The future became a project, not a prayer. The gods observed a world that continued to function even when they were silent. Bound and enduring, he recognized the outcome clearly. The act had not replaced the gods, it had replaced the need to ask them first. That shift carried an uncomfortable truth. Authority survives belief, not force. Once belief weakens, force becomes exposure. The gods chose distance over confrontation, myth over correction. Humanity continued forward, indifferent to the silence above. Fire illuminated paths that no prophecy had mapped. Bound and conscious, he understood the final cost of foresight. He had not freed humans from the gods. He had freed the future from waiting. From that moment on, the world no longer looked upward for permission. It looked forward for solutions. Fire became routine, and routine erased reverence. The gods remained, but they no longer defined direction. Humanity did. Bound and enduring, he accepted the final truth of his act. The greatest change was not what he gave them, but what they stopped needing once they had it. That acceptance did not bring relief. It brought clarity. The cost had been paid and it could not be refunded. The world advanced without asking who had opened the door. Fire warmed cities that never learned the name behind it. The gods watched a future that no longer needed justification. Bound and conscious, he remained the last point of continuity between intention and outcome, bearing witness to a change that would never look back. Time did what punishment could not. It normalized the impossible. Fire no longer felt stolen, it felt inevitable. Humanity built histories that assumed continuity and called it destiny. The gods preserved memory through myth, but myth softened edges. Bound and conscious, he understood the last transformation. His act had moved from transgression to foundation. When something becomes foundational, it stops being questioned. It simply carries the world forward. With questioning gone, responsibility shifted entirely to those who used what had been taken. Fire no longer offered excuses. Every failure now belonged to human hands. Progress exposed consequence without divine buffer. The gods observed a world that could no longer blame them for its direction. Bound and conscious, he recognized the final exchange. Power had been given, but so had accountability. And accountability does not allow return to innocence. Accountability altered how history was remembered. Triumphs felt earned, disasters felt deserved. Fire no longer stood between humanity and consequence. It revealed it. The gods became witnesses rather than judges, their silence interpreted as distance, not mercy. Bound and conscious, he understood the last shift. Freedom had not arrived with celebration, it arrived with weight. And weight, once carried, reshapes every step that follows. That weight became permanent. Humanity no longer stood beneath judgment, but beneath consequence. Fire illuminated creation and destruction with the same clarity. Nothing was hidden behind divine will anymore. Choices echoed without appeal. The gods observed a world that no longer needed punishment to learn. Bound and conscious, he recognized the final outcome. What he gave them was not safety. It was the burden of deciding what to become without anyone to blame. That burden reshaped how the gods were remembered. They were no longer feared as enforcers, but referenced as origins. Humanity spoke of them in past tense, even while their temples stood. Fire had moved the axis of belief from above to ahead. Bound and conscious, he understood the final irony. The punishment had preserved order in form, but not in function. What endured was not authority, but consequence. At that point, even memory began to fail. The act survived, but the man faded. Fire remained central while its origin dissolved into abstraction. Humanity no longer searched for the source of its independence. It lived inside it. The gods accepted a quieter role, maintaining distance rather than direction. Bound and conscious, he became the last living record of a moment when the future stopped asking permission and started assuming continuity. That continuity reshaped what legacy meant. History remembered outcomes, not sacrifices. Fire burned in every city without recalling the cost paid to release it. Humanity inherited progress without inheriting gratitude. The gods watched belief thin into tradition. Bound and conscious, he understood the final separation. His suffering remained real, but its meaning had dissolved. When a gift becomes ordinary, the one who paid for it becomes invisible. Invisibility did not erase consequence, it completed it. The act no longer required recognition to function. Fire sustained futures that would never trace themselves back to its origin. Humanity advanced without reference, without debt, without pause. The gods remained, but only as distant structures around a world already in motion. Bound and conscious, he became the quiet proof that some sacrifices succeed precisely because they are forgotten. For the gods, that was the final loss of control. A world that moves without memory cannot be guided by reminder. Fire no longer pointed upward or backward, it pointed forward, endlessly. Humanity did not feel abandoned, it felt capable. Bound and conscious, he understood the last transformation. The act had not created followers or rebels, it had created continuity. And continuity does not pause to ask who made it possible. Continuity erased urgency. What once demanded explanation became assumed reality. Fire no longer symbolized risk or defiance, it symbolized expectation. Humanity planned futures that required it by default. The gods observed a civilization that no longer paused at thresholds. Bound and conscious, he recognized the final outcome. His act had not broken the world, it had removed the need for hesitation. And a world without hesitation does not wait for judgment. Without hesitation, direction replaced obedience. Humanity no longer framed its future around limits set by others. Fire had taught momentum. Momentum erased pause. The gods retained presence, but not priority. Their influence survived only where it remained useful. Bound and conscious, he saw the final confirmation of his choice. The greatest shift was not power gained, but permission lost. The world no longer needed to be told what it could attempt. That loss of permission altered how humanity understood limits. Boundaries became technical, not sacred. If something failed, it was corrected, not forbidden. Fire had taught method over obedience. The gods watched innovation replace reverence, problem-solving replace prayer. Bound and conscious, he understood the irreversible truth. Once a world learns to fix itself, authority becomes optional. What remained was not defiance, but habit. And habit reshapes reality more quietly than revolt. Habit completed what intention had started. Humanity no longer measured its actions against approval, only against outcome. Fire became process, not symbol. Progress moved forward without narrative, without justification. The gods remained as reference points, not authorities. Bound and conscious, he understood the final symmetry. What began as theft ended as infrastructure. And infrastructure does not inspire loyalty, it simply supports whatever is built on top of it. With infrastructure came inevitability. Fire was no longer defended, debated, or protected. It was assumed. Humanity inherited a world that functioned because someone had once accepted endless consequence. The gods preserved memory only as story, not warning. Bound and conscious, he recognized the final cost of foresight. His act had succeeded beyond intention. It had removed the possibility of returning to innocence, forever fixing humanity inside its own momentum. By then, nothing remained to be corrected. Fire no longer pointed to choice or crime. It pointed to continuity. Humanity moved forward inside a system it no longer questioned. The gods accepted a world that no longer required their permission to exist. Bound and conscious, he understood the final alignment. The act had not changed the balance once. It had changed how balance was defined. What followed was not chaos. It was permanence. The punishment never ended. It did not need to. Its purpose had already been fulfilled in a way no god had planned. Fire burned everywhere, without memory of chains or sacrifice. Humanity lived inside the consequence of a single decision made long before it could understand it. Bound and conscious, he remained where the act began, no longer a warning, no longer a symbol, only the last witness to the moment the future stopped asking permission.